I noticed the way they looked at me before anyone said a single word, the soft voices, the tilted heads, the careful touches on my arm as if I might shatter, and in that moment, standing beside my husband's casket after 43 years of marriage, I realized they didn't see a woman who had just lost the love of her life. They saw a helpless widow with nothing left to her name, and I let them believe it. The church smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that lingers in places where people gather to say goodbye, and I stood there in my black dress, hands folded, nodding politely as one person after another offered their condolences, their words blending into a quiet hum that barely reached me, but their eyes, those I noticed, because they didn't carry grief, they carried calculation, pity layered with something colder, something practical, as if they were already measuring what would become of me now that Richard was gone. Vanessa was the first to step in. Close, her hand warm but her grip just a little too firm, her voice soft but rehearsed. "We'll take care of everything, Margaret, you don't have to worry about a thing," and I gave her a small, grateful smile, the kind people expect from someone in my position, the kind that says I am overwhelmed, I am lost, I am dependent, and behind her, my son Daniel nodded along, his expression carefully arranged somewhere between sadness and responsibility, as though he had already stepped into a role he'd been waiting for. I lowered my gaze, letting my shoulders fall just slightly, letting the image settle in, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow people to see exactly what they expect to see, even when it isn't true. The service moved on, voices echoing gently through the high ceilings, memories shared, stories told, but I noticed how often Vanessa leaned in to answer questions directed at me, how easily she redirected conversations, how naturally she began to position herself at the center of decisions that had nothing to do with her, and no one questioned it, not the guests, not even Daniel, who stood beside her as if this shift had already been decided long before. Today, I caught fragments of quiet conversations drifting through the room, phrases like "what will she do now" and "it's going to be hard for her," and each one landed the same way, not as sympathy, but as assumption, a quiet agreement that I was no longer capable, no longer in control, no longer someone who needed to be consulted, only managed. I stepped back from the casket, my fingers brushing the smooth edge of the polished wood, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the loss, the absence of the man who had always stood beside me, who had always known exactly who I was without me having to prove it, and then I straightened, just slightly, just enough to feel the shift inside me, that quiet, steady clarity replacing the fog of grief. When I turned, I saw Daniel speaking with a man near the back, his voice low, his posture tense, and Vanessa standing just close enough to listen, her expression sharp despite the softness she wore for everyone else, and I didn't need to hear the words to understand the direction of that conversation, because I had seen that look before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in moments when people thought they were about to gain something valuable. I walked toward them slowly, deliberately, my steps measured, and as they noticed me approaching, both of them changed instantly, faces softening, voices shifting, the performance resuming, and I almost admired how quickly they adapted, how naturally they played their parts. "Mom, are you holding up okay?" Daniel asked, his tone gentle, but his eyes searching, not for my well-being, but for confirmation of something else, something unspoken, and I met his gaze, letting a small, tired smile form as I nodded, because that was the answer he expected, that was the answer that would make everything easier for him, and for Vanessa, who watched me just a second too long before offering her own reassuring smile. I folded my hands in front of me again, feeling the quiet strength settle into place beneath the surface, and I understood then that this day, this room, this moment, was not just about saying goodbye to my husband, it was about watching my family reveal who they truly were when they believed I had nothing left to protect, nothing left to control, nothing left to give, and I decided, right there, surrounded by flowers and whispers and carefully disguised intentions, that I would not correct them, not yet, because sometimes the truth is most powerful when it is revealed at the exact moment someone believes they've already won. They arrived earlier than I expected the next morning, not with hesitation or uncertainty, but with the quiet confidence of people who believed they were stepping into a situation already under control, and I heard Vanessa's heels before I saw her, sharp and deliberate against the hardwood floor as she walked in without waiting for a full invitation, Daniel following just behind her with a folder tucked under his arm, his posture slightly stiff, as if he had rehearsed this moment but was still unsure how it would unfold. I was already seated at the kitchen table when they entered, a cup of coffee in front of me, untouched, my hands folded calmly as I looked up and offered a small, welcoming smile, the kind that suggested I was grateful for their presence, dependent on their guidance, and Vanessa returned it immediately, stepping forward as if this were her home now, her eyes scanning the room quickly, taking note of everything, assessing, calculating, before settling on me again. We thought it would be best to start organizing things sooner rather than later, she said, placing her handbag on the counter and moving toward the table with a sense of purpose that did not belong to her. And Daniel added something about paperwork, about making sure everything was taken care of properly, about easing the burden on me during a difficult time, and I nodded slowly, letting their words fill the space, giving them exactly what they expected. No resistance, no questions, just quiet acceptance. Vanessa pulled out a chair and sat across from me, leaning forward slightly, her tone soft but structured, explaining that there were a few immediate decisions that needed to be made, practical matters, she called them, like reviewing the house expenses, discussing future living arrangements, and possibly downsizing to something more manageable, something that would suit my needs better, and I noticed how easily she said it, how naturally she framed my life as something that needed to be reduced, simplified, relocated, as if the home I had built over decades was now just a burden to be removed. Daniel opened the folder and slid a few papers onto the table, his movements careful, almost cautious, as though he was trying to balance respect with urgency, and I let my eyes drift over the documents without really reading them, because I already understood their intention, not from the words on the page, but from the way they were presented, from the timing, from the quiet assumption that I would sign whatever was placed in front of me simply because I did not know any better. Vanessa continued speaking, outlining options that had clearly been discussed long before today, mentioning a senior living community just outside the city, describing it as comfortable, safe, convenient, and I could not help but notice the subtle shift in her expression as she spoke, the faint hint of satisfaction behind her concern, as if she was not just suggesting a solution, but executing a plan. I lifted my cup slowly, taking a small sip of coffee that had already cooled, buying myself a moment to observe them both more closely, Daniel's eyes flicking between me and the papers, Vanessa's posture confident, steady, unchallenged, and in that silence, I realized something important. They were not testing me. They had already decided who I was in this situation, someone who would not question, someone who would not resist, someone who would simply follow along. That sounds like a lot to think about, I said finally, my voice soft, measured, giving nothing away, and Vanessa smiled again, a little brighter this time, encouraged by what she interpreted as compliance, while Daniel relaxed slightly in his chair, as if a weight had just been lifted from his shoulders, and I placed the cup back down gently, my fingers resting against the ceramic as I looked at them both, seeing them clearly now in a way I had not allowed myself to before, not as family, not as people who needed my understanding, but as individuals who had already begun to rearrange my life in their minds the moment they believed I no longer had the power to stop them, and I decided, quietly and without hesitation, that I would let them continue. I would let them believe every assumption they had made, every conclusion they had drawn, because the more certain they became, the less prepared they would be for the moment when everything they thought they understood would be taken out of their hands. Vanessa's voice continued smoothly, outlining timelines and next steps, but I stopped listening to the words themselves and focused instead on the rhythm of her confidence, the way she spoke as if every outcome had already been agreed upon, as if I had already signed every document she placed in front of me, and it reminded me of something Richard used to say during long evenings at this very table, that the most dangerous negotiations were not the loud ones, but the quiet ones where one side believed there was nothing left to negotiate. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my gaze drift toward the window where the morning light fell across the garden he had planted years ago, and for a moment I was not in this kitchen with them. I was somewhere else entirely, standing beside him as he showed me the first draft of a document he had spent weeks preparing, his expression serious but calm, explaining that it was not about the money itself, but about understanding people, about knowing that wealth had a way of revealing intentions that would otherwise stay hidden, and I remembered asking him why he was so certain it would ever matter, why he thought anyone in our own family would need to be tested in such a way, and he had smiled then, not with cynicism, but with a quiet certainty that came from years of watching patterns repeat themselves. You do not prepare for what you expect, he had said, his voice steady. You prepare for what people might become when they think no one is watching, and at the time I had thought it unnecessary, even a little excessive, because I believed in the strength of what we had built together, in the idea that love and history would always be enough to hold things in place. but sitting there now, listening to Vanessa describe what would happen to my home, to my life, to the space that held every memory I valued, I understood exactly what he had meant. Daniel cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to the present as he pointed to one of the documents, explaining something about property taxes and maintenance costs, numbers that were meant to sound overwhelming, to justify the decisions they were guiding me toward, and I nodded again, slowly, allowing him to continue, allowing him to believe that his reasoning was working, that I was beginning to see things the way they did. Vanessa leaned closer, her tone softening even further as she suggested that it might be best to move quickly, to avoid complications, to make the transition as smooth as possible. And there it was again, that subtle urgency, that quiet push to move before questions could form, before resistance could take shape. And I let my eyes meet hers just long enough to acknowledge her words before looking back down at the papers, my expression thoughtful, compliant, exactly what she needed to see. Inside, however, everything had shifted into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt, because this was not about helping me, this was about control, about timing, about securing something they believed was within reach, and the more they spoke, the more certain I became that they had already convinced themselves of the outcome. I reached for the pen Daniel had placed beside the documents, my fingers closing around it with a deliberate calm, and I could feel both of them watching me now, their attention sharpening, their expectations narrowing into a single moment, and I paused just long enough to let that anticipation build before setting the pen back down gently without signing anything, lifting my gaze to meet Daniel's, then Vanessa's, and offering a small, almost apologetic smile as I said that I would need a little more time to think, just a day or two, nothing more. And the reaction was immediate, though subtle, a flicker of surprise in Daniel's eyes, a tightening at the corners of Vanessa's smile, quickly corrected, quickly hidden, but not fast enough to escape notice. Of course, she said, her voice still smooth, though the edge was there now if you knew where to listen. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly. And I nodded again, agreeing with her, thanking them for their help, watching as they gathered the papers, their movements slightly less certain than before, their confidence still intact but no longer absolute, and as they stood to leave, Vanessa glanced once more around the room, as if measuring it again, as if recalculating, while Daniel lingered for a second longer than necessary, his eyes searching my face as though trying to understand something that no longer fit the picture he had created. When the door finally closed behind them, the house settled back into its quiet rhythm, and I remained seated at the table for a long moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood, feeling the steady, grounded presence of something that had never truly left me, not even in the middle of grief, not even in the face of their assumptions, and I allowed myself a slow, measured breath as I looked toward the staircase, toward the room where the envelope still waited, because now it was no longer a question of whether I would use it, but when, and more importantly, how to ensure that when the truth was revealed, it would not just correct their misunderstanding, it would redefine everything they thought they knew. I did not open the envelope that day, even though I knew exactly what it contained, because timing mattered more than certainty, and certainty was something I already had. Instead, I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, allowing myself to see it not as a place I might lose, but as a space that still belonged entirely to me, every room holding a version of my life that no one else had the right to rewrite. And as I passed through the hallway, I noticed small things I had overlooked before: a drawer slightly out of place, a cabinet door not fully closed, subtle signs that someone had already begun to move through my home with a sense of ownership that had never been granted. I paused in the living room, my eyes settling on the side table where I kept important documents, and though nothing was obviously missing, there was a shift, an absence of the careful order I always maintained, and I did not need to search further to understand what it meant, because Vanessa had not just been planning, she had been preparing, quietly, methodically. Long before this moment, I sat down and reached for my phone, not to call Daniel, not to respond to Vanessa's message, but to scroll back through older conversations, messages that once seemed ordinary now carrying a different weight, suggestions about helping with finances, casual offers to organize paperwork, questions that had sounded like concern but now revealed themselves as reconnaissance, each one a small step toward the position they believed they had secured. I set the phone aside and allowed myself a single, quiet exhale, not out of frustration, not even out of disappointment, but out of recognition. Because this was no longer about guessing their intentions, it was about confirming them, and that clarity brought with it a calm I had not expected to feel so soon. Later that afternoon, I heard the front door open again, a soft click followed by footsteps that did not hesitate, and I remained where I was, listening as Vanessa's voice carried lightly through the hallway, calling out my name in a tone that suggested familiarity rather than permission, and when she stepped into the room, she looked momentarily surprised to see me seated exactly where she had not expected, her expression shifting quickly into that same practiced warmth as she explained that she had come by to drop off some additional documents, something about wanting to stay ahead of everything so I would not feel overwhelmed. I nodded, gesturing for her to set them on the table, and as she moved closer, I watched her more carefully than before, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the drawers, toward the shelves, taking inventory without appearing to do so, the way her posture remained confident, unguarded, as if she believed she was already operating within a space that would soon be hers to manage. She spoke for a few more minutes, filling the air with reassurance and efficiency, outlining next steps that had not been agreed upon, and I responded just enough to keep her comfortable, just enough to maintain the image she relied on, because the more at ease she felt, the more she revealed without realizing it. When she finally left, I did not follow her to the door. I simply listened as it closed, as her footsteps faded, and then I stood, moving with a quiet purpose that had nothing to do with reaction and everything to do with decision. I walked upstairs and entered the bedroom once more, crossing the space without hesitation this time as I opened the nightstand drawer and took out the envelope, holding it in my hands for a moment before breaking the seal with a steady motion, unfolding the documents inside and reading them slowly, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what they represented, the structure Richard had put in place, the conditions he had written with careful precision. Each line designed not just to protect, but to reveal, and as I reached the final page, I allowed myself a small, knowing smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of certainty, because now there was no question left, no hesitation, only the clear understanding that everything Vanessa and Daniel believed they were building was resting on an assumption that would not survive the truth. And as I folded the papers back into the envelope, I realized that the next step was not to confront them, not to correct them, but to give them exactly what they wanted, at least for a little while longer, because the deeper they stepped into the role they had chosen, the harder it would be for them to step back when the ground beneath them finally shifted. The next morning I called Mr. Howard Green before Daniel or Vanessa could reach me again, and when he answered, his voice carried the same steady professionalism I had always trusted, but there was something else beneath it this time, something like quiet anticipation, as if he had been expecting this call for longer than I realized. I told him I would like to come by his office, that there were a few things I needed to review in person. And he did not ask unnecessary questions, he simply said he would be ready whenever I arrived, which was exactly the response I needed, because this was not a conversation that belonged in my kitchen, not anymore. The drive into town felt different than it had the day before, the roads the same, the buildings unchanged, but my perspective no longer clouded by shock or grief, and as I pulled into the parking lot of his office, I took a moment before stepping out of the car, allowing myself to settle into the clarity I now carried, because what I was about to confirm was not new information, it was the structure behind everything I had already begun to understand. Inside, the office was quiet, polished, familiar, the kind of place where decisions were made without urgency but with finality, and Mr. Green greeted me with a respectful nod, his expression composed but attentive, as if he could see the shift in me without needing it explained. We sat across from each other at his desk, and for a moment neither of us spoke, not out of hesitation, but out of mutual recognition that this conversation would not be casual. And when I finally placed the envelope on the desk between us, his eyes moved to it briefly before returning to mine, acknowledging it without surprise. "I think it is time we go over everything," I said, my voice even, measured, and he nodded once, opening the folder beside him and retrieving a set of documents that mirrored what I had already read. Only now there was context, structure, intention laid out with precision. He explained each clause carefully, not as if I needed the explanation, but as if he understood the importance of hearing it spoken aloud, of reinforcing what had been designed years ago, the conditions tied to the estate, the protections put in place, the stipulations that would determine who received what and under what circumstances. And as he spoke, I saw the full shape of it, not just as a legal arrangement, but as a deliberate test, one that required patience, observation, and the willingness to let people reveal themselves fully before any action was taken. I asked him a single question when he finished, not about the money, not about the assets, but about timing, about when it would be appropriate to initiate the formal reading, and he paused for just a fraction of a second before answering, choosing his words carefully as he said that it could be scheduled whenever I felt it was necessary, but that in his experience, clarity was most effective when there was no room left for doubt. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant, because doubt had already been removed, replaced by certainty built from everything I had seen and heard over the past 24 hours, and I told him to prepare for a reading within the week, something formal, something that would bring everyone together, something that would leave no space for interpretation or quiet adjustments behind closed doors. As I stood to leave, he gathered the documents with the same precision he had always shown, but there was a subtle shift in his posture now, a readiness, an awareness that the situation had moved from observation to action. And as I stepped out of the office and into the midday light, I felt none of the hesitation I might have expected, only a calm, steady resolve that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with allowing the truth to stand exactly where it belonged. When I returned home, there was another message waiting from Vanessa, asking if I had considered their suggestions, offering to come by again to continue helping, and I read it once before setting the phone aside without responding, because for now, their version of events would continue exactly as they believed. They would move forward with their plans, their assumptions, their quiet confidence, and I would let them, not because I agreed, but because the more certain they became, the more complete the moment would be when that certainty was taken away from them, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with something far more final, something they would not be able to negotiate, explain, or undo. 2 days later I called Daniel and told him I had been thinking about everything he and Vanessa had said, and I made sure my voice carried just enough hesitation to sound believable, just enough uncertainty to confirm the version of me they had already accepted, and when I mentioned that perhaps they were right about the house being too much for me to manage alone, there was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted half a second too long, the kind of pause that reveals more than any words that follow, and then his tone shifted, lighter, almost relieved, as he told me that they only wanted what was best for me, that they would help make the transition as easy as possible. I agreed to let them come by that evening to talk through the next steps. And when I hung up, I did not feel the weight of the decision the way I might have before, because this was not surrender, it was alignment, allowing their expectations to move forward without interruption. They arrived together this time, not early, not hesitant, but right on time, carrying with them a quiet confidence that had returned in full, as if my agreement had erased whatever small doubt had surfaced before, and Vanessa walked in with a folder in her hand, already prepared, already organized, her movements efficient, purposeful, while Daniel followed with a more relaxed posture, his shoulders no longer tense, his expression softened by the belief that things were now proceeding exactly as planned. I greeted them with the same calm politeness, offering coffee, sitting at the table, letting them lead the conversation, and Vanessa wasted no time, opening the folder and laying out documents that had clearly been finalized in advance, her voice steady as she explained timelines, steps, arrangements that would move me out of the house and into what she described as a more suitable environment, something easier, something safer, something that removed the responsibility they had decided I could no longer carry. I listened carefully, nodding at the right moments, asking just enough questions to appear engaged but not resistant, and each time I agreed with a point, I could see it strengthen their confidence, could see Vanessa's posture become more assured, her tone more decisive, as if she was no longer suggesting but confirming what would happen next. Daniel added small reassurances, phrases about staying close, about visiting often, about making sure I was comfortable, but his words felt like additions to a structure that had already been built without me, and I accepted them with a quiet smile, because the more complete their plan became, the more defined the moment of its collapse would be. At one point Vanessa slid a document toward me, her pen placed carefully beside it, and I recognized the gesture immediately, the same quiet expectation as before, the same assumption that this was simply a formality, and I picked up the pen, letting the moment stretch just long enough for both of them to focus completely, their attention narrowing, their anticipation settling into certainty, and then I signed, slowly, deliberately, exactly where she indicated, not because the document carried the power they believed it did, but because I understood its place in the larger sequence of events. Vanessa's smile deepened, subtle but unmistakable, and Daniel exhaled softly, a tension released that he had not even realized he was holding. And as they gathered the papers, discussing next steps with a renewed sense of control, I sat back slightly, watching them not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that left no room for emotion to interfere, because this was no longer about what they were doing, it was about what they believed they had achieved. When they finally stood to leave, Vanessa thanked me for trusting them, her tone warm, confident, certain, and I returned the sentiment with the same measured calm, walking them to the door, watching as they stepped out into the evening with the quiet satisfaction of people who think they have secured something valuable, and as the door closed behind them, I remained there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the handle, knowing that everything was now in place, every assumption fully formed, every expectation firmly established, and all that remained was the moment when those expectations would meet the truth they had never considered. The reading was scheduled 3 days later in Mr. Green's office, and I arrived a few minutes early, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, because I had spent most of my life respecting moments that carried weight, and this one would define more than just the distribution of assets. It would define the truth everyone in that room would have to face. Daniel and Vanessa arrived together shortly after, their expressions composed, their movements confident, Vanessa carrying herself with that same quiet authority she had shown in my home, as if this was simply the final step in a process she had already completed, and Daniel remained close beside her, his posture relaxed in a way I had not seen since before the funeral, as though the uncertainty of the past few days had been replaced with a sense of resolution. They greeted me politely, carefully, but there was no tension in their voices now, only the calm assurance of people who believed the outcome was already in their favor, and I returned their greetings with the same steady calm, taking my seat across from them as Mr. Green entered the room with a folder in his hands, his expression professional, neutral, giving nothing away. The room itself was quiet, insulated from the outside world, the kind of space where conversations did not drift, where every word carried weight, and as we settled into our seats, there was a brief moment of stillness, a pause that allowed each person to prepare for what they believed was about to happen. Mr. Green began with a formal introduction, outlining the purpose of the meeting, confirming that this was the official reading of Richard's estate, and I watched Daniel and Vanessa closely as he spoke, noting the subtle exchanges between them, the small glances that suggested anticipation rather than concern, and when he finally opened the folder and began to read, his voice steady and measured, the first details unfolded exactly as they expected, references to property, to accounts, to standard provisions that gave nothing away, and I could see it in their posture, the quiet reinforcement of their confidence, the belief that everything was aligning with the plan they had constructed. Vanessa's hands rested calmly on the table, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the document she had brought, as if she was already preparing for the next step, while Daniel listened with a focused expression, his attention fixed on the words but his expectations already ahead of them, and I remained still, my hands folded in front of me, my gaze steady, offering no reaction that might disrupt the rhythm of their certainty. Then Mr. Green paused, just briefly, the kind of pause that might go unnoticed by someone not paying attention, but I had learned to recognize moments like that, moments where the direction of everything begins to shift, and when he continued, his tone did not change, but the content did, moving from general provisions to specific conditions, clauses that had been written with deliberate precision, language that left no room for interpretation, and I saw the first flicker of confusion cross Daniel's face, subtle, almost imperceptible, as he adjusted slightly in his chair. Vanessa remained composed for a moment longer, her expression steady as she listened, but there was a tightening at the corners of her mouth, a shift in her focus as the implications of the words began to take shape, and Mr. Green continued without interruption, outlining the structure of the estate, the protections that had been established, the requirements tied to inheritance, and with each sentence, the atmosphere in the room changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like the slow realization that something foundational has been misunderstood. I did not speak, I did not move, I simply listened, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was meant to, because this was not about confrontation, it was about clarity. About allowing the truth to exist in a space where it could no longer be avoided or reinterpreted, and as Mr. Green turned to the next page, preparing to reveal the full scope of what had been set in place, I saw the certainty that had carried them into this room begin to fracture, not loudly, not visibly to anyone who was not watching closely, but enough for me to know that the ground beneath their assumptions was no longer as solid as they had believed. Mr. Green turned the final page with the same steady composure, his voice never rising, never hesitating, as he read the clause that changed everything, the clause Richard had written not as a precaution but as a certainty, that any individual who attempted to pressure, manipulate, or remove me from my residence under the assumption of incapacity or dependency would be immediately disqualified from any inheritance, and the room did not react all at once. There was no sudden outburst, no dramatic interruption, just a quiet, heavy stillness that settled in as the meaning of those words fully formed. I watched Daniel first, because he had always been easier to read. His expression shifting from confusion to something sharper, something unsettled, as he replayed conversations in his mind, recent ones, the documents, the urgency, the decisions made without question, and beside him Vanessa remained very still, her posture controlled, her face composed, but the confidence that had carried her into this room was no longer intact, replaced by a careful stillness that suggested calculation rather than certainty. Mr. Green continued, outlining the full structure of the estate, the assets that had been secured, the accounts, the properties, the total value stated clearly, $28 million, not presented as a surprise, not emphasized, simply read as fact, and this time the reaction could not be contained in silence alone, because numbers have a way of forcing reality into the open, and I saw it in the way Daniel's shoulders tensed, in the way Vanessa's eyes shifted for the first time not toward the documents, but toward me. I did not respond. I did not acknowledge the number, I simply sat as I had from the beginning, allowing the information to exist without commentary, because this was never about revealing wealth, it was about revealing truth, and the truth now stood in the middle of the room where it could not be adjusted or softened. Daniel spoke first, his voice uncertain in a way I had not heard before, asking a question that was not fully formed, something about misunderstanding, about intent, about whether certain actions could be reconsidered. And Mr. Green answered with the same calm clarity, explaining that the language of the estate was precise, that it had been drafted with specific scenarios in mind, and that those conditions had now been met. Vanessa did not speak immediately, and when she did, her tone remained controlled, but there was an edge beneath it, a shift from assurance to defense, as she attempted to reframe what had happened, to present their actions as concern, as responsibility, as something other than what it clearly was. But the structure Richard had created did not rely on interpretation, it relied on behavior, and behavior had already been demonstrated. I met her gaze then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet steadiness that required no explanation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been said, not by me, but by the sequence of events they had set in motion themselves. The room settled again into silence, but this time it was different, no longer the calm anticipation they had entered with, but the kind of silence that follows realization, when the outcome cannot be changed, only accepted. Mr. Green concluded the reading, closing the folder with a soft, final motion that marked the end of the process. And I stood shortly after, not abruptly, not dramatically, simply rising from my seat as if the moment had reached its natural conclusion, and as I did, Daniel looked at me with something I had not seen in a long time, not confidence, not control, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a foundation has shifted beyond recognition. I did not offer comfort, I did not offer explanation, because neither was necessary. And as I walked toward the door, I paused only briefly, turning just enough to look back at them, at the space they now occupied without the certainty they had brought with them, and I realized that what they had lost in that room was not just money, it was the version of me they had constructed, the one who would accept, who would follow, who would allow herself to be moved aside, and without that version, there was nothing left for them to control. I opened the door and stepped out into the afternoon light, the air steady, unchanged, carrying with it a quiet sense of finality, and as the door closed behind me, I did not look back, because some things do not need to be revisited once they have been fully understood.